I'm Claire LeCan with University of Minnesota Extension and with the Midwest Cover Crops Council here today. And I will just briefly introduce the Midwest Cover Crops Council, which is a council of 12 states in the U.S. and 2 Canadian provinces. And with the goal of bringing consistent cover crop recommendations to farmers across the Midwest. And I want to introduce Stephanie McLain, who is our NRCS Minnesota Soil Health Specialist, who will be talking about cover crop ID. And at the end, we'll learn about our field guide through the Midwest Cover Crops Council from Anna Morrow, who is the Director Program Coordinator. And she'll talk a little bit about how to use the field guide for some of the things that Stephanie's talking about today. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Stephanie.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me here today, Claire and Anna and Midwest Cover Crop Council. I'm really excited to be a part of these sessions that you're having throughout the month of May and the month of June. A lot of great information that you're putting out there. Before I get started today, just wanted to add on to what Claire was saying. My name is Stephanie McLain. I am the soil health specialist for Minnesota NRCS. I have the wonderful privilege of getting to travel the entire state, working with farmers and conservation partners across the state and in other states if possible as well, advancing cover crop adoption and advancing soil health management systems. So it's a wonderful opportunity and privilege to be here today. So I will be talking about cover crop ID. The last thing that I will add for this is just a bit of thanks for this PowerPoint. This was a huge collaborative effort between a lot of different people to kind of put some of these slides together. It all started in Indiana with Corey Gerber. He had put some of these slides together, and then I was able to take that PowerPoint and add some other things to it. And then working in Minnesota, some partners, including Gabby Bulwark, Bailey Tangen with the University of Minnesota Extension, and Ryan Beto with Minnesota NRCS, all kind of contributed and added some additional things to this PowerPoint. So collaborative effort on many fronts with a lot of different people putting things in here. So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes great things don't just come from one person. They usually come from a lot of people, and I have a lot of people to thank. So the first thing we'll do is we'll move on. And as we talk about cover crop ID, often people spend a lot of time looking at the above ground portion of a plant. What do the leaves look like? What do the stems look like? And we'll get into all of that into just a minute. But I just wanted to start out with the first thing that I sometimes will think about or try to identify as I'm looking at a plant is what type of root are we looking at? Is it a fibrous root or is it a tap root? Because once we know what kind of root we're looking at, that can sometimes help us discern the type of plant that we're dealing with. Our fibrous roots, all of those roots are coming off of that main growing point at the bottom of the stem there, and all growing out very, very fine and all over the place in the soil, exploring lots of area of that soil. Our fibrous roots are what we commonly see on our grass plants. Taproots, on the other hand, are what we typically see on our broadleaf plants, and the taproot is usually just one root, and they do have roots that come off of it, like side roots or hair roots or lateral roots, or what they would be called. But our taproots are what we see on our broadleaf plants. The picture that we have there is a radish or something similar to a tuber like that, but taproots don't have to have a tuber. Taproots can look all different ways, but just think about the fact that a fibrous root, all of those roots are branching off from a main point going out and growing into the soil, whereas those taproots, it's one main root with lateral roots growing off of that main root. So we're going to get into the grass ID first. When we think about grass ID, there's a few things that you want to focus on, and they're highlighted here, not really highlighted per se, but also circled in green. So things like our spikelet or our seed head, which will also be called a panicle sometimes, are one of the things that you would look at for ID. If we're lucky enough to be looking at a grass plant when it's in the reproductive stage and we see a seed head, often we're out in the field when we don't have that privilege to just look at a seed head and make that call. Often we're looking at other things like the ligule, which is the front of the leaf blade and how it wraps around the stem, or the auricles, which also are kind of in that area as well. Whether the grass plant has a node or not, or what that blade looks like. So those are kind of some of the main things that we're going to be looking at here. Other things when we think about basic grass ID is the type of the seed head that we have there. What type of inflorescence do we have? Is it a spike, a raceme, or a panicle? So the biggest differences between these are whether we have the seed head or the spikelet itself attached directly to the stem, or if they're on a pedestal or a mini stem themselves, so they're coming off of that main stem, or if there's a lot of branching going on. So sometimes those things will definitely help for identification, again, when we have that privilege of seeing that seed head. The first plant that we're going to look at today when we look at grass plants are oats. The main characteristics that we see when we look at an oat plant is that the stems are smooth and hollow and they're jointed. So they have those nodes that we were talking about on the last slide. The leaves themselves are relatively smooth. Are tapered, so they start wider by the base by the stem, and then they get narrower as the blade goes out. One of the biggest, most identifiable characteristic of oats is its seed head, because it has that panicle inflorescence. So that's one thing that you can look at again. And the other thing that I like to use for identification is this large membrane ligule with no auricles. So we'll take a look at these things now. So up here on the left with our oat plant, you'll see this large membranous ligule. So very, very, very tall. It kind of goes up pretty far off of the leaf blade. Sometimes, I know this sounds a little bit strange, but you have to find ways to remember how to identify plants. And I often think of a ligule as like a collar, is it flipped up, or do we have a collar at all or not? And oats definitely thinks it's a pretty cool plant, so it likes to flip up its collar and have a very large ligule there that's standing up behind in front of that leaf blade. So think about that as a flipped collar on our oat plant. And here's another great picture of that ligule right there. It's just really tall, stands up a long ways in front of that leaf and around that stem itself. The panicle inflorescence, or the seed head of the oats, is very characteristic. So it's once you can see that, you really, you know that it's oats once you see that. And the last thing that we kind of see here when we look at oats is that it has that hollow, smooth stem. So when you cut it open, you see it's hollow on the inside. And then lastly, too, we have a fibrous root system. So again, that fibrous root system associated with grasses, we see it on our oats right there. The next plant that we're going to look at here is our cereal rye. Our plant characteristics, again, we have jointed stems, so we have nodes. We have flat leaf blades. The inflorescence is very dense and it's just a spike. We have a membranous ligule again, but it looks a little bit different than the oats. And on our cereal rye, we also have some auricles, and they're kind of short. The way that I really like to identify cereal rye in the vegetative stage is the fact that the leaf blades always have this curl at the top. I don't know why, but it never fails. You go out into a field, and if you're not sure what you're looking at, if you see this twist in the top of the leaf blade, and you can kind of see it here in this picture as I'm pointing it out, each one of these blades is kind of twisting just a little bit. Cereal rye just has that twist on those leaf blades, and that for me is my go-to when I'm identifying cereal rye in the field. If I see that twist, and that curl in the leaf blade, I immediately know that I'm looking at a cereal rye field. But if we go back and we look at some of those other characteristics that used to help us identify the plant, we can look at things like our membranous ligule. So we have, again, a ligule on the front part of that leaf blade right there, holding or kind of around that stem. It's not as tall as the oats. And then the other thing that we have on our cereal rye here on the upper right is we have some short auricles. So they come off the front of the leaf blade, and they kind of almost wrap around the stem, but these are short, so they don't wrap all the way around the stem. They just are kind of there a little bit. It's like kind of like a half hug. That's what the auricles are giving to the cereal rye stem there. They're just kind of partially going around that stem a little bit. The other thing that we see here is we have a really nice jointed stem. So again, as that seed head is pushing up through the plant, we get those joints forming on that stem. And then the other thing is our spiked inflorescence. And this plant has very long awns. So those almost like hairs or pointy materials that are coming off of that spikelet, those are awns, and those are very long, which is another characteristic of a cereal rye plant. So we've gone through oats, we've looked at cereal rye, and again, oats, think about a popped collar, and a very tall ligule. Cereal rye, we have those short auricles, and again, that twist on that leaf blade is the way that I remember cereal rye. Next, we're going to look at annual ryegrass. So remember, cereal rye and annual ryegrass are very different things. Our cereal rye is a more of a grain. It's in the grain family. We harvest grain from it. Our annual ryegrass is definitely more of a forage grass or almost like a lawn grass. So as we look at this plant, it definitely looks different. So our seed head is a spike with alternating spikelets. The leaves are glossy and hairless. The plants have a bunch-like appearance. And it does have a membranous ligule and clasping auricles, and of course the fibrous root system. So the biggest things that I look at when I'm identifying annual ryegrass is how shiny and glossy those stems are. They just look very waxy. And they do have a very waxy cuticle, but it's really glossy. That plant is very, very glossy. So as we look at this plant a little bit more, we can see some of the different characteristics that we would use to identify these plants. Up in the top left-hand side, we have that spiked inflorescence that is alternating spikelets. So every other side of that seed head, they're going up, alternating like that. So that's one of the characteristics that we use to identify the plant. It does have a membranous ligule. In this picture, it's a little bit difficult to see because the stem has been removed and it's kind of just collapsing on itself a little bit, but we do have a membranous ligule. And then the other thing that we have is that we have an actual clasping auricle. So in comparison to the cereal rye, which was kind of just like giving that half hug or just holding on slightly around the stem, annual ryegrass just brings it all in and just wraps those auricles all the way around the stem like a great big bear hug. So when you see those auricles that are wrapping around a stem like that, and we have that really, really glossy, shiny leaf blade that's a lot narrower than our small grain plants, those are the major identification characteristics that I use when looking at annual ryegrass. As we kind of talk a little bit more about grasses here, and you're going out to the field to either work with a farmer for identification or you're out there on your farm wanting to try to see what you have growing or pick out what you seeded, just remember that there is a potential for a lot of different grasses out there, whether we have some weedy grasses or foxtails or other things like that, or maybe we have some grasses that are there that maybe aren't a cover crop that's been growing, right? Some small grains that have been in those fields. Our barley here on the left, you see how long those auricles, similar to our annual ryegrass, they're long and clasping, wrapping all the way around that stem. Auricles on wheat, they're a little bit shorter, similar to the cereal rye, where the auricles aren't as long or aren't as clasping. And again, our oats, no auricles at all. And almost kind of on this picture here, I like to point out with the oats, almost kind of makes a little bit of a V because that leaf blade right there, how it wraps around there, it's open like that. So just remember that there might be a lot of different grasses out there when we're identifying them, and sometimes they're going to be weedy grasses and not always small grains or other plants that we intend to have out there. As we move on away from our grasses and start to look at some of the other different plants that we might be growing as cover crops in our fields, using leaves to identify that plant is a great way to do it. We have our simple leaves and our compound leaves. And when we have a compound leaf, we're going to have leaflets attached to that main leaf stem. So those are some of the ways that we're going to identify our plants. And then some of the other things that we might look at when we start to identify our broadleaf plants is whether a plant is pinnate or palmate. So when we talk about pinnate, this first one here on the left, it talks about that we have that main vein that goes from the stem of the plant through the leaf, and the veins extend from that midrib to the edges of the leaf. So that is a pinnate leaf type. And then the other leaf that we sometimes look at is palmate, where we all the veins kind of radiate from an outstretched or main part of the leaf petiole there. So think about like a palm and your fingers radiating from that main location, kind of like that, so that's why they call it palmate. So either we're going to have a pinnate or a palmate type leaf pattern when we look at when we start to identify these plants. We're going to get into some brassica identification. So as we kind of move into this a little bit more, we want to talk about leerate and lobed. And most of our brassica leaves are going to be this lyrate right here, leerate. And we're going to have this big lobe on the top and then small lobes below it. So it's going to be a pinnate. So we're having that main vein extend through the leaf and then other veins coming off of that midrib. And then this is what our leaf formation is going to look like. So let's kind of walk through some of the different brassicas that we can identify. Oh, and of course, if we are lucky enough to go out there when our plants are flowering, we can definitely see, our leaves, our plants and our flowers as well. So when we look at our brassica flowers, we always have 4 petals. And that's one of the things that I use to identify, because as we get into looking at some of the other plants that we can confuse for our brassicas, some of our natives, they always have 5 petals, whereas our brassicas have 4 petals. So that's another way that you can identify if we have a brassica out there. Whereas our plants like phlox, that they have 5 petals. So those are some of the things that we would look at with the petals. And then another characteristic of the mustard family or the brassica family are the seed pods, these mustard pods. They might come in different shapes and sizes as you see below here like this, but they always have those seed pods kind of coming up the stem. And as the flowers are done flowering and the plant has been pollinated, or the flowers have been pollinated, we see these seed pods forming like this. So that is another characteristic of the brassica family. So when we look at rapeseed, the key characteristics that we look at are that the leaves are waxy, and it talks about that they partially clasp the stem. The biggest thing is those waxy leaves. They're hairless, they're smooth, and they're light greenish blue. And I'm sure you're watching me because I'm thinking about when I go from a rapeseed to a radish to a turnip, and we're going to look at all of these plants. For me, it's all about feeling that leaf. And if I'm feeling a rapeseed leaf, that plant is so waxy and so smooth, it's almost like your fingers kind of stick to the plant just as you push a rub around on that leaf. They're just so smooth and waxy. So that's a great characteristic. The other thing that we're looking at here is that rapeseed has yellow flowers on it, and it does have a taproot. So again, we've moved from our grass plants and our fibrous roots to our broadleaf plants and our taproots. So more pictures of these leaves. You can see that they got this bluish greenish color, that the stem that we have is really smooth, and again, waxy leaves. And there's a great picture of that taproot, our main root coming down right here with some lateral roots extending off of that main taproot. And again, four petals on our flowers right there. The next plant that we're going to talk about in the brassica family is the radish. The radish has these deeply pinnately lobed, irregularly toothed leaves. So it's almost like every leaf on a radish plant is unique, and it has more lobes than our rapeseed. The leaves grow in a rosette around the stem, and it has pinkish, purplish, or whitish flowers. It's very well known for the large fleshy taproot. But I want to just pause a second before we talk about the taproot or the leaves. I want to talk a little bit more about the flowers, which we see in this great picture up here with the butterfly. Um, Again, purple flowers, purple, pinkish, whitish flowers. In the brassica family, rapeseed, turnip, kale, mustard, they all have yellow flowers. Radish has purplish, pinkish, whitish flowers, and it is the only one that we kind of work with in the cover crop world that has the purple, pinkish, whitish flowers. All the rest of them have the yellow flowers. So if you do go out in the field and you're looking at plants and you have flowers, if you see the purple flowers or white or pink, um, you can immediately know that that's radish. Whereas if we see yellow flowers, then it may be you need to kind of go into a little bit more of some identification of the leaves themselves to help you. But again, we don't always have that benefit of having flowers to look at. This picture of the large fleshy taproot that we have here in the middle, I put this picture in here because I really love to talk about how we can use our plants, especially our cover crop roots, as a diagnostic tool for looking at where we see compaction in the soil profile. So this is a great picture of a radish that was growing down and it hit some type of compacted layer, and the root kind of had to modify its growth and grow laterally for a little bit until it found some type of fracture and that root was able to grow back down. But so when I'm out there digging up radishes, I do like to try to find a couple radishes where I can try to expose that tuber as much as possible so I can see how it's growing in that soil profile. Again, the tuber helps for identification, but if we've already seen the tuber, we know it's a radish, but digging that hole and looking at that plant in the soil is just an added benefit. As we look at these flowers and these plants a little bit more, uh, this is a great picture of the rosette of leaves and how it kind of they grow around the top of that taproot and grow in that pattern like that. And then again, a great picture of the flowers. But the other characteristic that we look at are these uh, deeply pinnately lobed, irregularly toothed leaves. So by deeply lobed, you notice how these leaves, the lobes cut all the way down to the midrib as it goes. So very deeply lobed. I mean, almost 50% of that leaf is missing because of those deep lobes like that. And again, irregularly toothed. So there's not anything really super organized about it. They're not like matching from one side to the other. It's just that they are toothed on the leaf edges. So then if we take a turnip and we kind of talk about this a little bit in comparison, again, they're deeply pinnately lobed. So they have those cut ins on the leaves again as well. But in comparison to the radish, there's only 1 to 4 pairs of lobes per leaf, and they have a slightly hairy or prickly leaf. And time again, that's one of the things that I will feel on a plant if I'm trying to identify things. One is that leaf waxy and almost kind of sticky to your hand, so it's so smooth, it's almost, I don't know how to explain it, but just as you rub your hand over it, it's just really waxy. That's our rape seed, right? Our turnip, you rub your hand over it and it feels prickly and hairy. And I always wonder, do you actually notice those hairs when you're eating the turnip greens and stuff like that? But probably not. But just know that those hairs are on that turnip leaf. And just like the radish, these grow in a rosette around the stem, but they're bare towards the bottom of the stem. So there's not as many lobes or those going as far down the stem. And again, because this is a turnip, we have the yellow flowers. So if we kind of look here, we can see the yellow flowers and we see that fleshy taproot that's characteristic of our turnip. And then we can see our leaves of our plant. And you can't really see the prickly hairs that much in this picture, but it's again something that as you're out there going around working with the plants and you feel them, you'll start to tune in and key in on that characteristic. But let's talk a little bit more about what some of those differences are, right? So again, our radish, if we look at this picture here on the left, our radish plant, right? Deeply lobed, and those lobes go to the bottom of the stem. Almost always you see those lobes go all the way down to the bottom of the stem. And of course, our taproot is longer. And we compare that to a turnip. We have those lobes, but there's fewer lobes in the radish. Often those lobes end after 3 or 4, and then the rest of that stem is bare. So there's not, the leaves don't go all the way down to the base of that stem. So that's one of the major characteristic differences. And again, the fact that turnip root has kind of bristly, prickly hairs on it. And you don't see that as often on the radish, but that may also be a little bit of a variety thing when looking at these plants. The other thing that I kind of wanted to show you is just some of the differences of what these brassica seeds look like. I always thought it was strange that the radish flower was so different than all the rest of the other brassica flowers. Radish being a purple flower, all of the rest of them being yellow. But then when you start to look at seeds of these plants, this on the top is a picture of rapeseed seed, and on the bottom is our radish seed. And again, not that the seed makes a difference, but just kind of thinking about how I identify them or wrap my head around all these differences. If you take a look at rapeseed and compare it to kale and compare it to turnip, they all look exactly the same, except for the turnip is just a little bit smaller than the rapeseed and the kale. The kale and the rapeseed are pretty much essentially the same size, but they're small, rounded, blackish purplish seeds. You get over to the radish, and we're dealing with a browner, larger seed. Sometimes I think the radish seed almost kind of looks a little bit like a kidney bean. So there's a lot of differences between those two. And so sometimes I just think about the seed differences, and that helps me remember the differences of what I'm going to see in the flowers, colors, and the leaf blades and other things like that. As we move away from our brassicas, our broadleaves, we're gonna start looking at some more legumes. So we've looked at our grasses, and then we've looked at some brassicas, which is just a certain type of broadleaf that we focus on a lot in the cover crop world. And then some of the other broadleafs that we focus on would be our legumes. And legumes do have a different look about them. They have often they have the leaflets, so we have more of a compound leaf when we're going to be looking at our legumes. And the way that the flowers look on the plant are going to be a little bit different as well. Often we're looking at flowers that have a lot of little florets, so a lot of mini flowers on these flower stems. And then the other thing with our legume, of course, is that the legumes are nitrogen fixers in the cover crop world and in the crop world altogether. They are able to form that relationship with the rhizobium bacteria, have those nodules on their roots, and from that have that process of nitrogen fixing occurring. So again, we are seeing just some different additional pictures of leaflets and different ways that those leaves are out there. The other characteristic that we will see on our legumes often is if we don't have leaflets, we have trifoliates. So those are some of the things that we would use to identify our legume plants. So let's take a look at some of these. Crimson clover, it's probably one of my favorite legumes. I just think it's so beautiful when you see a whole field of crimson clover or a mix that has crimson clover in it. It's just so characteristic to be able to see that crimson red seed head. And all the little florets on that seed head like that. But again, we don't always have the benefit of having the seed head out there. So let's look at some of the other things that can help us identify that plant. The plant has very hairy leaves and stems. And again, it has the trifoliate, 3 leaflets per leaf. So let's take a look at some of the hairy leaves and stems. So here's a great picture of our trifoliate, 3 leaflets per leaf, and hairy leaf and stem. And that's not all that's hairy on crimson clover. Pretty much everything is hairy on crimson clover. The whole plant is hairy. So when you have some young seedlings, some legume seedlings coming out of the ground, that's some of the first things that I look at is how hairy is it? Because if it's like the stem is hairy, the leaves are hairy, there's just hair all over on this tiny little plant, that to me is a dead giveaway that it's crimson clover because it's just so fuzzy all the time. So that's one of the main characteristics besides that beautiful crimson flower that we don't always get to see when we're out there doing these identification processes. Here's another great picture of a taproot. We have that main taproot coming down the plant, and again, our lateral roots coming off that main root there. If we take a look at some of the other clovers are legumes that we see often in our cover crop mixes are used in alternative crop rotations. Red clover is a very popular one. So again, we have that characteristic trifoliate and our purplish pinkish flowers. I always think it's funny that it's called red clover, but we have purplish pinkish clovers, but I'm sure there's some reason behind that. Um, and also it talks about having hairy stems and petioles, so we'll see some pictures of that. And then the inverted V watermark on the leaves. So again, here's a nice looking taproot that we have on this plant. And then over here on the upper right-hand side, um, we talk about having a very hairy stem and a petiole. So there's hair on the plant on red clover there, but if you take a look at the leaves here on the bottom left-hand side, you'll notice that there's no hair on that leaf at all. So you'll see a little bit of hair in certain areas on the red clover, but no hair on the leaves, no hair um, on many of the rest of the plant except for those stems and the petiole where the flower is there. So just keep that in mind if you do use the hair as a characteristic. Again, hairy all over crimson clover, not hairy all over, a little bit of hair on the petiole and the hairy stem there, red clover. Also, that watermark is really great for identification, but I always kind of warn about using the watermark solely as an identification feature because I have seen watermarks show up on other trifoliate leaves as well. I've actually seen it on crimson clover leaves before. I don't know why, but I have seen it before. So typically, like the watermark will be a dead giveaway for me that I think this is red clover, but then let's take a look at those stems and see what it looks like. And fingers crossed, we might have a couple flowers out there as well, and that'll help for identifying that plant. But if not, like I said, take the watermark with just with caution, like make that assumption that it could be, but confirm it with what that stem looks like. Some of the other legumes that we have that we work with when we're putting cover crops out there is field peas. Um, Field pea is just a beautiful plant. It's a climbing plant. It has our tendrils, pale green leaves. It has pinnately compound leaves. They're in pairs of 1 to 4. Has a very well-defined taproot. And of course, we have our beautiful pea flowers and our pea pod that helps us to identify our field pea if it does grow that long. But some of the things that I would identify or help me to identify it are the leaves. We talked about that being pinnately compound. So there's those leaves on the plant like that. We don't necessarily have trifoliates on a pea plant at all. So thinking about that, those leaves being all opposite of each other. And then the other leaf that I always look at a lot is there always seems to be a leaf or two that kind of wraps all the way around the stem for some reason, and that's one of the things that I look at as well to help me identify a field pea. And then the last thing is those tendrils. If you have something that looks like a pea, but you're not sure, but we got tendrils out there, yeah, that's definitely a pea. So those are the main characteristics that I look at, is it trying to identify those leaves and then having that tendril on those leaves, trying to get that plant to be able to vine or climb onto other things. You'll see those tendrils very early on. Many of you have gardens and you grow peas out there, and that pea could, just be past the cotyledon stage and have its first set of leaves on it, and it's already got tendrils out there trying to grasp onto something and grow. So those tendrils will be visible very early on in the growth stage of the plant. The next plant that we have here is hairy vetch. Again, another climbing plant with tendrils. It has the pinnately compound leaves, so they're leaves opposite of each other, but they're very oblong, narrow leaves or leaflets. And then the purple flowers. So those are the things that I kind of try to use to identify the plant. And again, we don't always have the benefit of seeing the flowers, but this is another beautiful plant, and often deceiving in what size it is because it doesn't look like there's a lot of it, and you'll just pick up these masses of this plant because it almost kind of grows on top of each other if it doesn't have anything to climb on, and it'll grow kind of along the ground for a long ways, and you'll be picking up masses and masses of plant only to find this one tiny little stem that's growing into the ground that's attaching all of that. So I'm always surprised by how much mass can be put on by one single plant when you're looking at like a fully mature hairy vetch plant. So if we look at some of these flowers again, we have those beautiful little flowers, each one of these little florets like this, each one of them able to be pollinated. Um, and then what happens, it's interesting too, if you actually allow hairy vetch to go to seed, which is not necessarily something that you want to do when you're growing it as a cover crop, because once it goes to seed, you always have hairy vetch out there then, and that might not be a preferred thing for many growers, but it does actually have a seed pod as well, just like a pea, a little bit smaller, but there are seed pods on that plant. But again, when we're growing this for a cover crop, we don't want it to go to seed if we can help it. Um, we have those our leaflets right there. So really kind of oblong leaves that are opposite of each other on that stem, and usually 8 to 12 of those per stem. So you can get really long stems and have those narrow leaflets on there. And when you look down at that plant on the ground, just like this lower right-hand side, just how that plant there's just leaflets everywhere, just massing over the surface of the ground. And then they have those tendrils as well. It seems like it seems like hairy vetch doesn't grow up as much, often because we don't always put it with things that it likes to climb on, but it does seem to grow up a little bit and then just grow along the ground. The one time I did see hairy vetch kind of growing and climbing up on plants quite a bit was when it was planted. Someone planted it with buckwheat, and then it liked to climb up on the buckwheat plant and hang on that. So that was kind of neat to see, especially as that buckwheat was done growing and had started to dry, and the plant itself was brown, and that hairy vetch was just still hanging on there like that. So that was kind of cool to see. So what we've gone through here is just a small handful of plants that we kind of can use for identification. And again, like I said, I kind of went through, some of the more rigid identification processes, talking about the leaflets and the type of flowers that we have, and whether we have auricles and ligules on our grass plants. So some basic identification. But one of the things that I really advocate for is for you to try to find ways to remember that plant yourself. Like I said, for me, it's whether the plant is popping its collar or not, that grass plant. How much of a ligule does it have? Um, are the auricles there? Is that plant getting hugged by the auricles really tight, or is it just a slight hug? That to me helps me remember whether it's wheat or cereal rye versus annual ryegrass, how glossy those leaves are. So a lot of visual cues that I use to remind myself of what kind of plants I'm looking at. The cereal rye and how those leaf blades just twist at the top, or there's a curl at the top every time. So those are the characteristics that I like to think about and remember as I go through that process of looking at those young seeds out growing in the fields. Um, but one of the things that I just kind of wanted to go through here towards the end is looking at, not only can we see a lot and identify plants of looking at like that above ground growth, but taking into account sometimes what that below ground growth looks like as well. Again, we think about our grass plants like we see here on the left-hand side of this picture, very fibrous root systems that are growing from those grass plants. And then as we move over into our broadleaf plants, we see more of a taproot. And sometimes when you look at this picture, you're like, especially like the sunflower, it's like, how can there even be a taproot in there? But there is one main taproot, and all of these lateral roots are shooting off of that one main taproot. It's just that sunflower has such an amazing root system. And we can see that over and over again and looking at, again, whether we're looking at a fibrous root or a taproot, and just seeing how those plants grow and being aware of those differences when we think about the different rooting structures of cover crops. And again, kind of using it as a way to identify those plants, but for me, it's just about as much about digging in the soil and looking at those roots, more for beyond identification, but for looking at that soil and looking at that root structure and seeing how it's growing and using that as an indicator of what's happening in the soil. Um, And I think for me, those are the only slides that I have for you today. And I know that we're gonna switch over to Anna so she can talk about the Midwest Cover Crop Council's cover crop guide.
Yeah, I noticed there are a couple questions in the chat. So, Stephanie, if we want to answer those first, that might be best. The first question is, can you explain the difference in leaf shape more? I thought lyrate and pinnate were different, but you use them together when explaining rapeseed.
Oh, this is a good question. Let's see here. I'll go back up to that. So the pinnate is describing like the vein pattern of that leaf shape a little bit, and the lyrate is kind of describing like that bulbous pattern on the top of the leaf, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like it's a pinnate leaf pattern, but then the leaf the vein pattern, but then we have the lyrate is the leaf pattern. So it's more looking at the vein pattern and then the leaf shape itself. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. We had another question about rapeseed. Is it also a rosette leaf growth around the stem? So do we still have that rosette shape with rapeseed?
We do, yes. It is rosette around there. It just is not, there doesn't seem to be usually as many leaves that go around the rapeseed stem. So it's not talked about quite as much as if we look at, say, our radish stem and just seeing how many leaves you can see around there. But then when we look at that rapeseed, you do see some of those around there, just not quite as many. So it is a rosette, but not quite to the same extent.
Okay. I think those are all the questions at the moment. If there are any more, please feel free to put those in the Q&A and we'll try and get any of those details clarified. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. I did just want to quickly go through our pocket field guide. So it's a nice little reference when you're working at identifying cover crops in the field. We've got many of maybe the same or very similar photos that Stephanie shared. And we've also got, some keys to identifying those plant structures like the ligule and auricle, petiole, cotyledons. All those are kind of defined in the field guide, and we've got just kind of a quick reference on ID. So just in these last few minutes we have here, I'd like to just go through the field guide and show you that it is more than just identification, although I think it's a really excellent reference for that. Um, and it's just a nice little size to put on the dash of your truck in your pocket, take to field days, share with clients. Um, and you can see our list of table of contents here. We've got, basically all the cover crop management questions that you may have. We've got some quick references in there for you. Um, it was originally released in 2012, and our third and latest edition was released in 2021. And we continue to improve that over the years. And as management practices change, we update different things in the guide. So we've got a whole host of topics in here about choosing your cover crop. Should you do a pure stand or a mix? Some suggestions for cover crops and some common rotations for the Midwest. How to seed, how to fertilize, how to terminate. If you're looking into planting green, we have a new section on that. How cover crops could be weeds or weed fighters. We've updated the herbicide carryover table, some pests, diseases, economics, and then some considerations on different programs. And then probably the more popular section are the cover crop species pages, which do have those identifying features. So we'll just kind of click through and do a preview of the field guide here. We did update the cover crop seeding recommendations based on the most recent climate data. And so we've kind of adjusted those seeding dates. We've added an early interseeding timeframe to the field guide. That's something that's becoming more popular. And just a quick reminder, make sure and check out our website. We have other resources that go into more depth than we're able to do in that short field guide. So our cover crop recipes are another good reference. Our cover crop seeding, this section has been divided into timing and equipment. So based on your timing or equipment constraints or opportunities, you can check out this section of the guide. We have included some specialized equipment, so a drill interseeder, harvest mounted seeder, toolbar mounted seeder, and a drone. So those are some new practices that we've included in the guide. We've also got some termination guidelines. So we like to encourage farmers who are new to cover crops to terminate early in that 6 to 12 inches tall and actively growing. And as you get more experience, you can delay termination for some additional benefits. We've also got a section in the guide that talks about when our plans don't carry through, when the weather doesn't cooperate. And so we've got some recommendations in there for how you might deal with a delayed termination based on your area of the Midwest and what the USDA NRCS termination zone that you're in. Again, planting green is included in the guide. It's become more popular lately. And the advantages and disadvantages of these practices are detailed in the guide. We try to provide some keys to success, some things to watch for to help you be the most successful with this practice as possible. There's also a few tips on using cover crops as weed fighters. There are some species that tend to suppress weeds, and this is highly dependent on the cover crop biomass and making sure we have a uniform cover crop stand. So that's included in there. We've also done quite a bit of work to revise the herbicide carryover table. This is now organized where corn and soybean herbicides are all listed within the same table, so there's no searching between different tables to look for your herbicide, and they're organized by common name instead of trade name, trying to kind of simplify things a little bit. We added a section on voles. This is something we've seen more interest in lately. And we've also revised the insect, nematode, and disease sections. And so we encourage you to commit to scouting for pests when you use cover crops. It's really a change in management practice. There's also an economics section that kind of mirrors that cover crop economics publication from SARE that you see on the screen there. We know that cover crops can have both positive and negative effects. When you have some experience and good attention to your management, you can really boost that success. So we can see soil productivity and soil health improve slowly by using cover crops over many years. And we're going to see those benefits more in the stressful years. So, drought stress, different, stressful situations than we would in good weather conditions. And again, just the disclaimer that economic impacts can be highly variable. So there's a little bit more detail in the guide for you there. So I would say this is our most popular section of the guide. This is the cover crop species. We did add 3 new species, and we added a section called species commonly used in a mix, and that's got 10 different species on it. So each of those, we'll see, it gives a lot of detail for each cover crop species. So those most popular species, they've got selection benefits. So what goals do these cover crops meet? And that's just in that little, chart with 4 different dots, so you can quickly visualize what the strength of those cover crops are, rated from poor to excellent. And we also give the seeding rates for each cover crop in pounds of pure live seed per acre, based on your seeding method. So for each cover crop species, we give the seeding rates, and they're always given as a pretty broad range, because we understand that there are a lot of different conditions and purposes that we're using cover crops, and so we want to account for that. We've updated the photos in the guide, and included many more photos, particularly that leaf collar region that Stephanie was discussing for our grass cover crops. And we try to get those, those nice close-up shots that are going to help with identification. So we've included all of the most popular cover crop species, and there are 4 pages in the guide dedicated to each of these species. So that's going to go through, the advantages and maybe some cautions, planting, seeding rates, what are the environmental tolerances, how do we terminate these species, and then a lot of those identifying features that we discussed today are described, and also have some good photos in there to help with ID. These are the new species that we've added. White clover was previously not in the guide. Forage brassicas, these are a little different. They've really been bred for that forage and leafy biomass characteristics. So we've added that into the field guide. And then there's a lot of interest in Balanza clover. So we've got that in the up and coming species. I really like this section. It's a new section of the field guide, species commonly used in a mix. So we often get questions about some of these less common species that we'll find in those really diverse mixes. So some of the vetches and faba bean, flax, lentils. So we've tried to include lots of photos. There are photos for each of these 10 species. We've got a photo of the seed, seedling, and the plant. So that was really helpful with identification, I think. And then you can see in the table here, we've got some of those key characteristics and some comments related to advantages and cautions with each species. So that's just a very quick overview of the field guide. It's very good for identification, but also has a lot of other good information in there about managing your cover crops. So you can check out our website if you're interested in those. Happy to answer any other questions. I want to really thank Stephanie for being on this morning. This was a great overview of cover crop identification and some good tips on ID in the field. So if there aren't any more questions, I think that's it. Stephanie, do you have anything to add?
I was just going to say thanks so much for putting this together, Anna and Claire and Madeline. And I loved how you went over that the cover crop guide. I use that thing all the time. I'm always having a booklet with me in the field or anywhere that I go, because I do find that to be really, really useful. Just all of that information at your fingertips. So much appreciation to MCCC for putting that together.